Upon that of infinite divisibility we cannot go even this length, but are reduced merely to the general appearance as the rule by which we determine lines to be either curve or right ones. But though we can give no perfect definition of these lines, nor produce any very exact method of distinguishing the one from the other, yet this hinders us not from correcting the first appearance by a more accurate consideration, and by a comparison with some rule of whose rectitude from repeated trials we have a greater assurance. And it is from these corrections, and by carrying on the same action of the mind, even when its reason fails us, that we form the loose idea of a perfect standard to these figures without being able to explain or comprehend it. It is true, mathematicians pretend they give an exact definition of a right line, when they say it is the shortest way betwixt 2 points. But in the first place, I observe that this is more properly the discovery of one of the properties of a right line than a just definition of it. For I ask any one, if upon mention of a right line he thinks not immediately on such a particular appearance, and if it is not by accident only that he considers this property. A right line can be comprehended alone, but this definition is unintelligible without a comparison with other lines, which we conceive to be more extended. In common life it is established as a maxim, that the straightest way is always the shortest, which would be as absurd as to say, the shortest way is always the shortest, if our idea of a right line was not different from that of the shortest way betwixt 2 points. Secondly, I repeat what I have already established, that we have no precise idea of equality and inequality, shorter and longer, more than of a right line or a curve, and consequently that the one can never afford us a perfect standard for the other. An exact idea can never be built on such as are loose and undeterminate. The idea of a plane surface is as little susceptible of a precise standard as that of a right line, nor have we any other means of distinguishing such a surface than its general appearance. It is in vain that mathematicians represent a plane surface as produced by the flowing of a right line. It will immediately be objected that our idea of a surface is as independent of this method of forming a surface as our idea of an ellipse is of that of a cone, that the idea of a right line is no more precise than that of a plane surface, that a right line may flow irregularly, and by that means form a figure quite different from a plane, and that therefore we must suppose it to flow along 2 right lines parallel to each other and on the same plane, which is a description that explains a thing by itself and returns in a circle. It appears then that the ideas which are most essential to geometry, that is, those of equality and inequality, of a right line and a plane surface, are far from being exact and determinate according to our common method of conceiving them. Not only we are incapable of telling if the case be in any degree doubtful when such particular figures are equal, when such a line is a right one, and such a surface a plane one, but we can form no idea of that proportion, or of these figures, which is firm and invariable. Our appeal is still to the weak and fallible judgment, which we make from the appearance of the objects, and correct by a compass or common measure, and if we join the supposition of any farther correction, it is of such a one as is either useless or imaginary. In vain should we have recourse to the common topic, and employ the supposition of a deity, whose omnipotence may enable him to form a perfect geometrical figure, and describe a right line without any curve or inflection. As the ultimate standard of these figures is derived from nothing but the senses and imagination, it is absurd to talk of any perfection beyond what these faculties can judge of, since the true perfection of any thing consists in its conformity to its standard. Now, since these ideas are so loose and uncertain, I would fain ask any mathematician what infallible assurance he has, not only of the more intricate and obscure propositions of his science, but of the most vulgar and obvious principles. How can he prove to me, for instance, that two right lines cannot have one common segment, or that it is impossible to draw more than one right line betwixt any two points? Should he tell me that these opinions are obviously absurd and repugnant to our clear ideas, I would answer, that I do not deny, where two right lines incline upon each other with a sensible angle, but it is absurd to imagine them to have a common segment. But supposing these two lines to approach at the rate of an inch in 20 leagues, I perceive no absurdity in asserting, that upon their contact they become one. For I beseech you, by what rule or standard do you judge, when you assert, that the line in which I have supposed them to concur cannot make the same right line with those two that form so small an angle betwixt them? You must surely have some idea of a right line to which this line does not agree. Do you therefore mean, that it takes not the points in the same order, and by the same rule, as is peculiar and essential to a right line? If so, I must inform you, that besides that in judging after this manner you allow that extension is composed of indivisible points, which perhaps is more than you intend, besides this, I say, I must inform you, that neither is this the standard from which we form the idea of a right line, nor, if it were, is there any such firmness in our senses or imagination as to determine when such an order is violated or preserved. The original standard of a right line is in reality nothing but a certain general appearance, and it is evident right lines may be made to concur with each other, and yet correspond to this standard, though corrected by all the means either practicable or imaginable. To whatever side mathematicians turn, this dilemma still meets them. If they judge of equality or any other proportion by the accurate and exact standard, that is, the enumeration of the minute indivisible parts, they both employ a standard which is useless in practice, and actually establish the indivisibility of extension, which they endeavour to explode. Or, if they employ, as is usual, the inaccurate standard, derived from a comparison of objects upon their general appearance, corrected by measuring and juxtaposition, their first principles, though certain and infallible, are too coarse to afford any such subtle inferences as they commonly draw from them. The first principles are founded on the imagination and senses. The conclusion, therefore, can never go beyond, much less contradict these faculties. This may open our eyes a little, and let us see, that no geometrical demonstration for the infinite divisibility of extension can have so much force as what we naturally attribute to every argument which is supported by such magnificent pretensions. At the same time we may learn the reason why geometry fails of evidence in this single point, while all its other reasonings command our fullest assent and approbation. And indeed it seems more requisite to give the reason of this exception, than to shew that we really must make such an exception, and regard all the mathematical arguments for infinite divisibility as utterly sophistical. For it is evident, that as no idea of quantity is infinitely divisible, there cannot be imagined a more glaring absurdity than to endeavour to prove that quantity itself admits of such a division, and to prove this by means of ideas which are directly opposite in that particular. And as this absurdity is very glaring in itself, so there is no argument founded on it which is not attended with a new absurdity, and involves not an evident contradiction. I might give as instances those arguments for infinite divisibility which are derived from the point of contact. I know there is no mathematician who will not refuse to be judged by the diagrams he describes upon paper, these being loose draughts, as he will tell us, and serving only to convey with greater facility certain ideas which are the true foundation of all our reasoning. This I am satisfied with, and am willing to rest the controversy merely upon these ideas. I desire, therefore, our mathematician to form as accurately as possible the ideas of a circle and a right line, and I then ask if upon the conception of their contact he can conceive them as touching in a mathematical point, or if he must necessarily imagine them to concur for some space. Whichever side he chooses, he runs himself into equal difficulties. If he affirms, that in tracing these figures in his imagination, he can imagine them to touch only in a point, he allows the possibility of that idea, and consequently of the thing. If he says, that in his conception of the contact of those lines he must make them concur, he thereby acknowledges the fallacy of geometrical demonstrations, when carried beyond a certain degree of minuteness, since it is certain he has such demonstrations against the concurrence of a circle and a right line, that is, in other words, he can prove an idea, that is, that of concurrence, to be incompatible with two other ideas, that is, those of a circle and right line, though at the same time he acknowledges these ideas to be inseparable. End of File 13.